Ethiopia. Today, I'm very pleased to be here to coordinate, to facilitate this event. You can hear me? I hope you can. Okay. Okay. I'll try to speak louder. Yeah. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I think the first thing that I should say is to say thank you to IISD for giving us this platform. We thought this was a wonderful opportunity to share some of the research that we do at the Africa Trade Policy Center over in Addis. And today I have my colleague Simon Mabel, who will be sharing, will be presenting research that he has been leading there with us, focusing on regional value chains, but in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and asking some of the difficult questions that were raised earlier this morning. In the very first plenary session that we just attended, I'm sure all of you are there, I thought some of the key issues were coming out already. The scene was being set very well. Yes, we all agree that the planet needs to be protected. We all need to make our own contributions. The issue is one of burden sharing and equity. I thought that was a very beautiful way of putting it. In Africa, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, which we believe is a transformational instrument that has to help us overcome the legacy of small and fragmented markets. All the projections, the analysis that has been done, both within ECA in Addis as well as elsewhere, they show that the AfCFTA can make a great contribution to Africa's development. But then, of course, that is dependent on the implementation of the AfCFTA. We understand that, and there are several challenges in that area. And then, of course, if the AfCFTA can support or help Africa's development, what will its contribution be in terms of climate change? These are the kinds of difficult questions that Simo has been grappling with, and he will be sharing the findings with us. And Simo, in the following the presentation, will be joined by a very high-powered panel of three leading experts who are here with us. I can start with Mrs. Habiba Ben-Barka from UNCTAD in Geneva, and then Madame Annalisa Primi from the OECD, and then Mr. Lucien Serrat from the EU Commission in Brussels. All of them experts in this area. They will have insights to share with us. I have shared a few kind of guide questions to facilitate the conversations already with them. So I will now invite Simon to take about 15, maximum 17 minutes that we have given you here, Simon, to share your presentation. And then I will invite the colleagues to step in. The presentation, this session is being recorded. It's not live stream, it's being recorded. So Simon, you can take it away from me, and you can start. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Melaku. Good morning to everyone. I understand we have a strict limit of time. We have to finish within the hour, so I will try not taking longer than what you gave me. And as you said, it's really a presentation to set the scene for the discussions with the panel that we will have just after the presentation itself. And so it's going to be based, as Melaku indicated, on actually two recent pieces of work that we have done at ECA. But before that, maybe very briefly, to make sure we are all on the same page, because the focus is going to be on the AfCFTA. I just wanted to remind everyone that so there are negotiations that are ongoing in the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement. That started officially in 2015, and it has been conducted in two phases. So the first phase is broadly completed. There are still a few outstanding issues that needs to be resolved, but basically it was about three key topics, each of them giving birth to one specific protocol. So one on trade in goods, one on trade in services, and one for a dispute settlement body. Then there have been a second phase of the negotiations, which also is very much advanced in the sense that the first 3 protocols that you see here on investment, intellectual property rights, and competition policy, they have been completed, and they are yet to become operationalized. And then the last 2 on digital trade and women and youth in trade were just adopted a couple of weeks ago at the African Union Summit that took place in Addis Ababa. So the agreement officially entered into force in May 2019. Trading under the agreement was supposed to start as of the 1st of January 2021, but on the ground, the trade between the state parties really started in October 2022 after the AfCFTA Secretariat, which is based in Ghana, decided to launch the Guided Trade Initiative. So it was to bring together 7 and quickly after 8 countries that were ready to trade under the AfCFTA as pilots with a mapping of products that they could start with exchanging between themselves. Now it has expanded quite a lot. We have more than 30 state parties that do trade under the GTIs, under the AfCFTA more broadly, but still under a limited range of products. And we hope that it's going to pick up quite massively in the coming months and years, of course. In terms of the signing and ratification of the agreement, so there are 55 African Union member states. The UN recognized 54, but here we are talking with the AU nomenclature, classification, and only one of the 55 African Union member states has not signed the AfCFTA agreement, that is Eritrea. And another 7 have signed but have not ratified yet. So we are today with 47 countries that have both signed and ratified the agreement, and so that technically are in position to implement the provisions that have been negotiated under the agreement so far. At ECA, in the African Trade Policy Center, we have produced a small brochure that you can find online in both English and French, which is frequently questions and answers, anything you may want to know about the AfCFTA. We try to respond to those questions in a very simple manner. And now we are in a process of updating the Q&A because we want it to be live and updated regularly. So let me now go into the topic. I don't know how long I have left. I didn't want to spend 10, 12 minutes. Yeah. Perfect. So essentially, we have been doing jointly with CEPI. CEPI is a research center. It's a French acronym, Centre d'études prospectives et d'information internationale, who is well known for data and modeling work. And so we decided to partner with them to produce 2 empirical studies on the AfCFTA. And this is the link with the sessions that we have today. The first one is really to try to see what are the implications of the AfCFTA to build regional value chains in Africa. And the second one, and they actually are totally consistent in terms of the framework and the scenarios. The second one, which was done before, was actually looking at the climate change implication of the AfCFTA. So I'll not go into the technical details, and I know I really want to focus on the result, but we use a computable general equilibrium model, CG model, and the Mirage Power, which is the one that was built specifically for the second study, has an expanded energy module in it, where we have also, various energy sources, fossil fuels, nuclear, and then renewable sources of energy. We capture CO2 and non-CO2 emissions. And then Mirage VA, the one that is listed in number 1, is actually an extension of Mirage Power, which has also the energy component into it, but that differentiates trading goods by type of uses, whether it is for final consumption or intermediate consumptions, which is quite important when we want to look at value chains implications. On the AfCFTA agreement, we try to mimic as much as we can what has been agreed under the agreement itself, and then I'll explain later. So we have liberalization on trading goods and services, and also we tackle non-tariff measures. And then when I come to the second study, I'll first focus on the first study and then the second one. I will present what are the climate policies that we are implementing on top of the AfCFTA in the model. Before, and just in case I ran out of time, I'm going to tell you what are the key findings that we got from those studies. So first, with the first study that focuses on value chains, two key findings. The first one, I think, is not new to anyone, but we confirm that Africa performs at the lower end of the global value chains, and that is largely explained by a weak backward participation in global value chains, and there is also very little regional value chain development at the moment on the continent still. Then the second study is if we tackle the tariffs and non-tariff measures under the AfCFTA as it is planned for both, final and intermediate goods for goods and services for final and intermediate consumptions, then clearly we see that there is potential for regional value chain development, and we pin down on those sectors that could benefit the most in terms of regional value chain development in the context of the AfCFTA. Passing to the second study, where we incorporate on top of that climate policies, we see that if we implement the AfCFTA agreement, we can boost intra-African trade, and that has very little negative impact on climate change. This is something that could appear somewhat surprising, but I will explain in a moment why is that. Knowing, of course, that what we know is that Africa has been impacted by climate change, but contributing very little to it, and so they are starting from a very low base, and that is part of the explanation, obviously. The second finding is when we consider climate policies to be implemented on top of the AfCFTA reform. So here we look at the nationally determined contributions that the countries have committed to under the Paris Agreement. And then we look at an alternative, which is, okay, what if the African countries adopt carbon pricing instruments? What would that mean for reduction of GHG emissions? And what we see, which is quite important, is that the carbon pricing approach seems to be quite effective and efficient to meet Africa's climate objectives. So now, very briefly, to go into the results, I have 3 slides for each of the study. This is the first one. On the left side, we look and we compare the evolution of key main regions' participation in global value chains over the last, let's say, 30 years. And what we see, Africa is in red. It has increased slightly. It has doubled in terms of the index. You see from 4 to 8% of the GDP, but it's still quite low. And compare especially on the top the high-income countries, obviously, and even Asia and the Pacific, although for them as well in the last decade it has been decreasing somewhat. What is probably more important is the focus on Africa on the right side, where we split that same line on the left, but we split it by 2 components of the value chains. The backward leakages at the bottom, so these are basically foreign value added that are embedded in a country's export. So it means that what Africa would be imported in terms of intermediates from outside of the continent that they will use to transform and then export. So these are the backward linkages, and that's the flat line at the bottom, and then forward linkages that has been picking up quite substantially, but these are basically the domestic value addition or value added that is that a country that is embodied in the export of third countries. So let's say a country is adding value addition, exporting to a third country that uses it to then make its own value addition, and this is the forward linkages. And so what I have very little time, so what we see here is that the backward linkages is very flat and very low, and in fact that's what in the literature we see and we confirm in our analysis is what would be the most important to drive incomes in the countries. And so that shows that Africa is particularly weak in backward linkages, backward participation in global value chain, which limits its benefits from participating in the global value chain so far. Now, just briefly, we are looking at statistics here, trade and tariffs. So if you look at the left side, that's Africa's import from main sectors from within Africa on the left and from the rest of the world on the right. I'm looking at the graph on the left, which is about final consumption, and then you see that both what Africa imports from the rest of the world is mainly industrial final goods, and what they import from within Africa, as far as final consumption is concerned, is also industrial products. Now, if you turn to intermediate consumption, which is quite important when we think about backward linkages, we have the same picture, which for Africa's import from the rest of the world, mainly industrial product, but it's different within Africa with mostly intermediate imports of energy followed by industry. And this is really where the AfCFTA can make a difference. Because in addition, when you look at the average tariffs and non-tariff measures, both the tariffs in goods and then the NTMs on goods and services, you see that, and that's quite interesting, whether you look at final consumption or intermediate consumptions, the tariffs that Africa imposes to itself on final consumption, it's 13%. The tariff that it imposes to the rest of the world on imports of final consumption goods is lower. And we have the same pattern everywhere. So it means that Africa is actually treating better, whether it's tariffs and non-tariff measures, the imports from outside of the continent than the imports from within the continent. And definitely the AfCFTA can really make a difference in this. Here is very briefly the key sectors where we observe when we run the model where there is potential important benefits in terms of expansion of intra-African trade, but at the same time that generate value added, because this is what really matters here, is that we want to make sure that, okay, intra-African trade is increasing, but that generates value addition, and that can contribute to increased participation in regional value chains and most broadly global value chains. And here we find in blue you have agri-food products, and then in green industrial products. It's very consistent, interestingly, with the priority value chains that have been determined under the AfCFTA processes, which are agribusiness, automobile, automotive industry, and also pharmaceutical. We find all of them here, and more than this that could actually benefit from regional value chain development in the AfCFTA context. Now, I think I just have maybe 2 minutes. In terms of the climate policies, I'll not go into the detail, but I can, in the conversation, if needed, I can elaborate. We consider 4 scenarios. The first scenario we consider, because I think I need to state it still, in the nationally determined contributions, there are 2 parts. There is one part that is supposed to be unconditional. This is the one that the countries are committed to meet with their own resources. And there is one part that is conditional, that the countries would need support from external partners to be able to finance that part. And in Africa, only 10% of the overall NDCs are actually to be financed with Africa's own budget. 90% is subject to the support they can get from external partners. Because of that, we have different level of ambition scenarios that we consider. The first one, low ambition, is 100% unconditional targets to be met. That's this 10% that I was talking about. Then we have a scenario where we go a bit beyond that, 100% of the unconditional plus 1/4 of the conditional one. and then one where we have 100% of the unconditional and half of the conditional one. We don't go to 100% because you will see that we simulated it and it's extremely costly. And then we have in parallel another scenario, which is okay. We have the indices, but let's compare now with carbon pricing. What if Africa put a price on carbon in the continent, so all the countries adopting the same price across all the sectors? So quite an assumption, but it's really to have a basis to understand what is coming out of that. And here we pick 25 because that was a proposal by the IMF. They have put forward a proposal where low-income countries could go with 25, middle income with 50, and high income with 75. So we decided to go with 25 for Africa because there is a majority of the African countries that are LDCs. I am running out of time, but just briefly to say what I was indicating at the beginning, that we have the AfCFTA, with the implementation of the AfCFTA, we assessed that intra-African trade could be about 35% higher in presence of the AfCFTA compared to absence of the AfCFTA in the year 2045, and that would have very little impact on the greenhouse gases emissions. I'm happy to go in the discussion and into the details, but maybe because I just have 1 minute, just two things I want to mention. This, which is important, if you add, so with the AfCFTA, negative impact on climate change, but quite limited. With climate policies implemented on top of the AfCFTA, so let's start with NDCs, there is a trade-off. We see that if you implement climate policies on top of the AfCFTA, then you would have quite substantial reduction in greenhouse gases, but the gain in intra-African trade would become a bit lower. And so the first three scenarios are the one with the NDCs. You see, as you go higher in terms of ambition in the climate policy, the greater would be the reductions in greenhouse gases, but then the gain in intra-African trade would be slightly lower as we implement the climate policies. But the carbon price scenario is interesting because it actually has a quite important impact on the reduction of greenhouse gases emissions for the continent, and at the same time it's preserving quite well the intra-African gains. And then lastly, and I will finish here, apologies Melaku for the time I have taken, but this is the cost of the reform, so the cost of implementing climate policies on top of the AfCFTA. We assess it in a way that we assess the cost of avoiding 1 ton of carbon. So in the first lower ambition scenario, it means that it would cost $17.2 to avoid 1 ton of carbons when you implement that policy. And then the higher you go with the NDCs, the more costly it becomes. $46 almost with the more ambitious scenarios that we consider. Imagine if we would have done 100% unconditional, 100% conditional, we could be around $80 per ton of carbon to be avoided. While the carbon pricing scenario is quite effective, only $26 to be able to pay for that implementation. So I'll stop here and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon. Colleagues, as you can see, there is a lot of technical exercise that went into this research that came out with these impressive-looking figures. Some of them might look counterintuitive, but that is for all of us to discuss. And after we hear from our discussants, I'm hoping that we'll have around 10 minutes, slightly more than 10 minutes, for discussions, for questions and answers in the room. So now I'm going to invite Madame Annalisa Primi, the head of the Economic Transformation Division at the OECD Development Center. Annalisa, I think Simon's research started by looking at Africa's place in global value chains. And I know you are leading an initiative for policy dialogue on global value chains and then productive transformation and development. and I will say the same thing when I introduce others as well. It's not by accident that Africa sits at the bottom of the value chains. Trade policy itself has contributed a great deal. I think I still remember those of us who have studied this area, tariff escalation is to be a major issue, where the exportation of raw materials would be encouraged, the exportation of processed products would be discouraged by the very structure of tariffs in many, especially the developed countries. So I would like you to come in and share with us your perspective, of course, first introducing the initiative that you are leading, but also how that can contribute to Africa's efforts to move up the global value chains. Annalisa, over to you. You have 7 minutes, Annalisa.
Okay, thank you, dear Melaku, and thank you, Simon, for a very, very interesting presentation. Thank you for having me with you and to have in this group an honest discussion about these issues. Melaku, you asked about. What I want to say, it's a little bit linked to the work that we are doing in this OECD initiative for policy dialogue on global value chain production, transformation and development. That initiative was set up more around 10 years ago, and ECA has been an instrumental partner in cooperating with us to really try to see how participating to global value chain could support development. And in 10 years, we arrived to say, well, actually, it's not really participating to value chains, but it is how and what you do in global trade. So I want to react a little bit on these topics in terms of saying what we can do together. The platform meets 2 times per year. We are actually meeting in November at a plenary meeting in Addis, and I hope to see most of you joining. But I don't want to talk about the project. I really want to focus on the very interesting presentation and the work that you're putting forward. Let me tell you why I like the AfCFTA work that is happening, all the negotiations and the push, and why I do like ECA approach on it, which is really linking trade integration to industrialization opportunity. You have this beautiful report about industrializing to trade. I think that the focus, it's important. And to me, there are 2 things which are linked to the not. So I like AfCFTA has an opportunity to look at how to trade not what Africa is producing today, but what Africa could produce tomorrow. And I think this is important in the narrative because worldwide, we do need to change how we produce, what we consume, how we trade. And if Africa can do it in a continental way, this can be a very powerful add to changing the world, how it produces, trades, and consumes, which is what we need to do because we need it to make it sustainable with the planet. We don't need to go into deep growth. We need to start just to change the direction and how we do it. And the other thing that I think is useful, and this is why I like the work that you're doing, is not only to think about participation to value chains. I think the issue is what typology of value added we are generating and how we are able to capture the value that it is generated in production for the different producers, and how do we translate that value into real development opportunity, being them quality jobs. This is a big preoccupation for many African countries, or being that really innovation and value addition that can allow you to lead the next industrial frontier. I think sometimes the discussion on value chains, it's a kind of old one. It's interesting, but I think here it's much more transformative. If AfCFTA really works, and if Africa is able to maintain the political commitment and the capacity to make this work in practice, we can have new players defining the next industrial revolution, which we're missing because we do need to face the energy and infrastructure transition. So, we were looking at the numbers, and we are working on the issue of critical minerals, and I want to say a couple of things on that too. And I think, when you look at the value of non-energy minerals into the final consumption of produced goods, take it a car or a phone. I know there is no average car. I know we're working on changing the content of minerals in cars, and then in the future our cars will be lighter and using different materials. All of this, yes, but approx in the last 20 years, the value added coming from non-energy materials into a final manufactured product is around 2%. It's little. So the issue is not to participate into the value chain and to be the provider of something that is going to be produced, owned, and managed somewhere else, but it is how do you create industrial powers that are actually able to capture the value from trade. And I think this is very coming prominently from the approach that ECA is having. You know, we do advise countries on industrial transformation strategies. We have this tool which is called Production Transformation Policy Reviews, and we do implement it with ECA and other UN organizations, and this is actually what we're seeing in our work with, we're working with NLDC as Togo, and we work with Egypt. So I think we have to think of those two things, not what we're trading, what we're producing today, but how can trade allow us to produce new and different things, and how the agreement can help different African countries to actually benefit more from their participation to different value chains. And I think here there is one issue which I think is very important and which I still don't see much openly in the discussion on AfCFTA, even on your very interesting analysis on the sustainability and how the carbon price is changing or doesn't change, is the value addition that the trade agreement can build, is the issue of managing divergences. You know, here we are thinking of creating a trade agreement among very different countries, very different capabilities. We have manufacturing powerhouses, we have countries with ambitions, we have a lot of LDCs. So what are the mechanisms that are we going to have in place to actually manage the divergences? Because the divergences are going to be there, and somehow we need to find a way to bring all them in. I mean, the EU is an example of creating agreements that then create parallel mechanism to try and ensure that this actually doesn't leave region, places, or given people behind. And just on the sectors, I like that you go specific into industries. To me, I do see three very important areas. Of course, all industries and everything is relevant, from textile to everything. But I think we need to look at the issue of critical minerals and how the integration and AfCFTA can play out there, especially to avoid the risk of entering into what I call a la carte negotiations or agreements. So we do see this push for AfCFTA, but then in parallel we see a lot of negotiations and discussions going on in terms of certain countries. We do need that material for our industries, and we have a strong demand from advanced countries on security of their supply chains. You know, how the AfCFTA can actually play as a safeguard to ensure that we're not in a next round of extractivism, and that actually critical minerals could play the transformative role that they could play if Africa acts on it united. You know, I'm thinking about Egypt in years becoming a demander of minerals, while today they're not. I mean, if they manage to do their strategies, this is what they will need, and they want to do scale up in electronics. So today they're not demanding, but in the future they are. And then there is the issue of infrastructure and energy transition, which I think we do need to take into account. Sometimes when we look at trade, we tend to forget a little bit the infrastructure, but now the infrastructure issues are strongly linked to the energy transition, which has a strong component of trade dynamics. And of course, the industries that are needed to secure the more urgent or potential future needs of the continent, so the food and pharmaceuticals, I think that these are extremely important areas that we should be looking at. Let me stop here, and thank you for the opportunity to reflect.
Thank you very much, Annalise. I think used your time very effectively, and I think you identified a number of key issues, including, and I put it as a good assignment for us to work on going forward. You know, how do we manage diversity of membership in Africa in this area? You are absolutely correct. Our countries are at very different levels. We often talk about Africa as if it is one, but the diversity is huge. So, Lucienne, I'm going to come to you now. Mr. Lucien Sernat is the head of the Regulatory Cooperation Public Procurement unit at the Directorate General for Trade at the European Commission. And very often, yes, the EU is a major exporter of many things, but we often talk about the EU as the exporter of regulations, the exporter of standards as well. And we have the head of that Regulatory Cooperation team with us. So again, I start with really the same premise that I started with earlier, Lucienne. You have a new proposal that you call the new global value chains for LDCs as a kind of initiative. And what is going to be different, as a result of the kind of initiative that you are leading right now, that you are proposing right now? Because as I was saying earlier, the fact that Africa or many least developed countries find themselves at the bottom of that value chain is not accidental. Even trade policy itself has contributed, as I said. Resources, minerals will be dug out and exported as raw minerals rather than benefit from some kind of value addition in situ. So what do you think is going to change as a result of this initiative? What are the ambitions of this new initiative that you are proposing? Lucian, over to you. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Melasco. Hello, everyone. I'm very glad to be here today in parallel with such an important meeting as the WTO Ministerial. I think all the great minds of trade policy making and people interested in trade from civil society are here in Abu Dhabi, a city with a great history in global trade. If you visit the Louvre Museum, you will see one of the first trade systems for facilitation and documentation. It's a bunch of clay balls with seals, and I think that's the first bill of lading that humanity has actually used for international trade. And it's probably symbolic that we are here today to keep the ball rolling. I think we need to keep the WTO ball rolling, and trade has been over time a very powerful engine for development. And I would say a few words about this new initiative, which I'd like to say from the outset that is not an institutional EU initiative. What I'm going to say here today is in my personal capacity, so please bear that disclaimer in mind. I'm here in my personal capacity, and my views are personal. They may not reflect the EU Commission's official position. And I would also like to thank Malaku and colleagues for the invitation. Now, what is the logic behind this new initiative that I hashtagged as GVCs for LDCs? Essentially, if you look at the contribution of trade for the well-being of pretty much 60, if not more than 60% of people living in LDCs, because they are people who depend on agriculture, the promise of trade has only been partly fulfilled. And I think the glass is half empty, and we should not be too pessimistic and only look at the empty part of the glass, because I think there are important elements that we can tap into. And the concrete example I wanted to get into a few more practical details is the ability of LDCs to export organic products at the highest standards using digital certification tools. Now, can you imagine people who probably have only a bike as a means of transportation, and maybe even that bike is broken? People who have to pass shoes from their older brothers to the younger brothers to go to school. Can you imagine those farmers being able, with a smartphone, to scan a QR code, upload a certificate from a mobile lab that will test that the mangoes are organic and complied with the highest standards in the world for organic products, which, like it or not, they have been developed in Europe. And once they do that, you find the organic mangoes in the shelf of my supermarket. And that gives that poor farmer a price premium. In Europe, at least, organic products are 40 to 100% more expensive than normal products. And when we look at the trade statistic, we see that this extra premium goes back to the countries of exportation. The UN, I think more than a decade ago, wanted to double the share of LDCs in trade and in supply chains. What happened since? Nothing. LDCs are still at 1% of global trade. Really. With little efforts here and there, but basically nothing. When you look at the line, it's flat. What is the share of LDCs in exports to the EU? It's in line with our UN SDG goal. We wanted to go from 1% to 2%. In the EU, we are at 2%. Probably not surprisingly, because we offer LDCs duty-free, quota-free for all their products. Now, look at our agriculture products from LDCs. As I said, these are the kind of products on which the LDCs can actually build value chains and they can add value locally. The share of LDCs exports to the EU, we import basically 3% of all our agriculture imports from LDCs. It's not 1%, it's not 2%. In agriculture, it's already 3%. Now, quick quiz. What's the share of LDCs in EU organic product imports? How much do we import from LDCs in organic product? Anyone? It's 10%. 10% is 5 times more than the total share of LDCs. It's 10 times more the current share of LDCs in global trade. How did we do it? Well, all the credit goes back to the LDCs. They are naturally inclined for organic products. When they do so, I think Simon will be pleased to know that organic agriculture in LDCs has between 20 and 40% less greenhouse emissions. So if you go organic, you immediately contribute to the climate change objectives we all try to achieve. Surprisingly, I think this is a misconception. Organic agriculture, we've been taught that has lower yields, that is not so productive. In semi-arid areas, the latest research shows that the best way to adapt to climate change is to go organic. If you use fertilizers, you're going to ruin the soil. Ethiopia doubled its productivity after 3 years of adopting organic soil management techniques. And that's why Ethiopian coffee is the best. And that's why Ethiopia thrives on exporting coffee for the benefit of those farmers. So what is the initiative? Essentially, we have all this unilateral scheme. We give duty-free quota-free to LDCs. Australia does it. The US will probably bring it back one day, depending on the call of the Congress. Many countries will have this initiative to say, well, on LDC products, let's give them duty-free access. But the moment a product from LDC has to cross several borders, and that is what a global supply chain is, you lose your LDC origin status. If I export raw coffee beans from Indonesia and I want to roast them in Turkey, and then I want to bring them back to another country, Indonesia is not an LDC. I meant Ethiopia. Indonesia is also big on coffee, but whenever you have a product that crosses borders, you lose the LDC status of that product, and it can no longer be imported, let's say in Europe, under duty-free, quota-free. So you have two options. Either you can process it more in the country and then export directly, but that's not the world of today. Products cross many borders. We looked at organic products, nuts, cashew nuts, mangoes, all sorts of things. They cross multiple borders. So the GVC for LDC says a product that has originated in an LDC, an ingredient, no matter how much is going to be further processed, no matter where is going to be further processed, should preserve that LDC status on the basis of the existing certificate of origin. We all have this certificate of origin, and not pay duties along the supply chain. What will that give? That will give companies an incentive to source more from LDCs or to place production in an LDC, because how do you get all these tariff benefits? And don't forget that on processed food, most countries around the world have double-digit tariffs. So if you want to capitalize on tariff savings, you should place as much productive capacity in an LDC if you can. But if you can't, at least you compete, and LDCs have a very low production compared to the world demand. Imagine the entire world competing for products originating in LDC. You have a huge price premium for LDCs. So that's the initiative. I think we have the basis for it. In reality, we can start small with these organic products where the digital certification gives us a bulletproof online platform to work on. And I hope that I made it sufficiently clear to entice you into thinking about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucia. And you certainly have. I think of course, the moment you talk about organic agriculture, the issue of standards and everything will come with it. We know those issues relating to space and all that, but I hope that will come up during the discussions. Habiba, I'm now coming to you. You are the head of the Africa section at AfCFTA-led, which deals with the policy analysis and research branch. And of course, you have recently published a major report the Economic Development in Africa report, where we looked at the potential of Africa to capture technology. Luciano was just talking about digital certification of organic products as one tool. Can you please tell us something about the report and the kind of conversation that we're having? How do we actually assist African countries to go up the value chain? And of course, the whole discussion is taking place in the context of the sustainability issues that we are discussing, the issue of climate change, and then Simon's analysis about what it will mean, Africa implementing the AfCFTA, what does it mean for the environment, etc. But focusing mainly on the report that we have issued. Habiba, over to you, 7 minutes.
Thanks, Melaku. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. For those that are probably connected online, thanks to you and Simon for inviting UNCTAD to be part of this discussion. The report that we published last year, where we are looking at how African countries can capture technology-intensive supply chains. We are not talking about value chains only. Supply chain, and I want to make a specific distinction because people have a tendency to confuse those two. So a supply chain is looking at the different process. You're looking at procurement of input, intermediate raw material, intermediate input that go into the manufacturing of a specific product. It can be a car, it can be a mobile phone, it can be medical devices and so on. And then after the procurement of those inputs, you go into the production of the actual product. And then you also have the distribution, you have the logistics around that distribution, you have the export of the goods that are manufactured, and then you have also the services that go into after the sale of those products. So what we are looking in this report is looking at the different value that you add into all those steps. So it's not only value chains, but it's adding value to different steps of the supply chain. So why we looked at that report last year is that we realized in the past few years, because of the global shocks with the COVID-19 pandemic, the trade wars between US and China, the war in Ukraine, that has really disturbed a lot of the supply chains globally, and a lot of companies are starting looking at, okay, how can I basically safeguard my supply chain? How can I build resilience around it? Do I need to reshore? Do I need to friendshore? Do I need to nearshore to really avoid any disruption that can happen in one region that will affect all my different supply chain in my industries? So we looked at it as maybe an opportunity for African countries to see, okay, is that now time for African countries to look at, can we play a role, any significant role in those supply chains? Because they are not basically playing any significant role beside countries such as South Africa or Egypt or Morocco or Nigeria to a certain extent. Then we try to look at the industries that have been mostly affected by those global shocks, and those are basically technology-intensive industries. You have the automotive sector, you have the technology such as the mobile phone, you have the renewable energy sector, you have also the pharmaceutical sector, and we try to look at, okay, African countries play what role in this full supply chain? Basically, they are just suppliers of tier 3 products, which are basically the raw materials that go into the manufacturing of some of those products or some type of intermediate inputs. So we try to look at, okay, can they go one step further through that full supply chain? And of course, for them to be playing a significant role in those supply chain, then we need to look at the private sector within African countries. So when it comes to supply chain, basically it's a relationship between a buyer and a supplier. So we are not talking about industry, we are talking about firms. And in many African countries, those firms or those industries are mostly small to medium scale, so they are SMEs. Are they playing any significant role? No, they are not. So then in the report, we try to look at what policymakers need to put in place to really capacitate the African domestic private sector to basically be probably the supplier or the buyer through those different supply chains, especially in those different industries. So of course, technology is critical. When you talked about, Lucien talked about the technology that is required in some of the procurement of some of those input, even through the distribution, you're talking about the technology that we'll be talking about advanced automation, for instance. You have additive manufacturing, you have artificial intelligence, you have machine learning, you have blockchain technologies. For instance, blockchain technology will enable you to facilitate the transparency and traceability through your full supply chain. You have machine learning algorithm that will enable, for instance, a firm to forecast market trends and demand, so at least you will know which type of product or which quantity of product you need to manufacture, so you'll be not left with a significant inventory if there's any crisis that happen within a specific region. So you have all those technologies that are really critical to not only safeguard your supply chain, but diversify your supply chain and enable you to really build resilience if there's any shock that happen. What, 10 minutes left for me or overall? Okay, how many minutes do I have left?
2
I was
minutes.
hoping.
2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes. And then, so when we looked at the African markets, what can they offer? And then to participate in those global supply chains, we realized that they have a lot of deficiencies. And so technology will need to be embraced on the continent. Regulatory frameworks, policies need to be in place to really bring that spirit of technology that will adopt the new technology, enterprises that will start innovating. So those are some of the policies that we are really looking at in the report to really incentivize African governments to put in place some of the policy and regulation that will facilitate those technology adoption and also innovation. And one critical aspect is looking at technology also in even financing supply chain. This is one critical area that we realize that is really lacking in African countries. So when we talk about supply chain finance, it's not a new financing mechanism globally. But in Africa, it doesn't exist. Very few countries, such as South Africa, Nigeria, Zambia, and I think another country that have program in place to really facilitate SMEs or firms access to supply chain financing so they can participate into the different supply chain. So coming back, linking it to Simon's presentation. Sorry, I need to jump. Half a second.
No problem.
Extra second.
Linking it to, it's a health issue. So linking it to Simon's presentation with the CFTA. So in the report, we also realized that the CFTA presents an opportunity to really create regional value chain, because you cannot just integrate global supply chains if you don't have regional supply chains that are in place. So hopefully the different policies and protocol that will be put in place by the CFTA can hopefully facilitate that one. But before the CFTA, we need to know that there was some initiative at the regional level, and you, ECA, are one good example. For instance, when we face the challenge of accessing to medicine and vaccine during COVID, for instance, ECA was able to really bring African policymakers together to create that pool procurement process, which really facilitated procurement of not only vaccine, but even inputs that can go into the manufacture of some of the medical devices, protective devices that we use to really mitigate some of the risk of COVID. So I don't know if I have 1 more minute. No? Yeah, I have 1 more minute. Okay. So basically, for us, we saw it as an opportunity. So African can really integrate some of those global supply chains. Although we say it's high technology intensive, how African countries can do that, they don't have any skills and so on, but slowly they can start from, let's say, a tier 3 supplier to becoming a tier 2 suppliers, to providing some of the logistics that we're talking about e-commerce. It was mentioned earlier today at the plenary. So e-commerce is critical, and African countries have really been driving and adopting e-commerce on the continent. A lot of countries such as Kenya, the example that was in your presentation, Simon, you talked about Kenya. Kenya is one of the countries where the adoption of technology, digital banking and so on is really thriving. So there's really opportunity there and there's potential. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Habiba. So, colleagues, there you have it, and I think now I'm going to open it for discussions, comments, reactions from you. I believe, I don't know how long we have. How long do we have now in total? I'm looking at my colleague over there.
5 minutes.
To finish?
5, yeah.
Oh, okay. Very good. So let me, without further ado, let me just open it for reactions. So I see 4 hands, 1 minute each, and I will use 1 minute to conclude. Yes, please, sir.
Yes,
If you just briefly introduce yourself and then proceed.
I am from the European Economic and Social Committee, and in this committee I represent civil society. So I highly appreciate all presentation, and I would like to ask the first, which was very sophisticated. You mentioned about $25 per ton. Up to COP28, only 49 countries signed agreement, and 25 5 they are on the waiting list. Postponing of implementing price carbon, it will be huge impact for the future. So how do you see when they will introduce and why they are not hurrying now? And if they will be hurrying, it will be too late. So
Okay.
what about your opinion?
Thank you very much. Yes, please, sir.
Mario Stokas from Center for International Sustainable Development Law, so from the academia. Two questions, maybe more technical. In the research that was presented, the difference with regards to the cost of implementing the 100% unconditional and the 50% conditional from the carbon pricing. The difference in the cost is because we expect a revenue from the carbon pricing, or simply it's cheaper to implement. And the second, with the rules of origin, something very technical. If we allow for a tariff-free access to goods manufactured or processed in a developing country, but originally the raw materials are sourced from LDCs, wouldn't just give the incentive to simply use the raw materials from the LDCs and not manufacture there, since it will be costlier to actually set up production in the LDC. Rather, I would just source in a nearby developing country and then send it to the developed countries. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please.
I'm basically from Swiss Farmers Union, and since we talk a lot about agriculture, I have to say something. Dairy and meat, we saw there is a big potential for lowering tariffs in Africa between countries. The trade could increase. This would be very profitable, but for whom? Because especially dairy and meat is very important for livelihoods in remote areas, people like we have on the picture there. And often the efficiency on the macroeconomic level is not the best for their future. So please take into consideration that. And we talk about sustainability, not only about CO2. So sustainability includes also the livelihoods out there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did I see a fourth hand on this
Yes,
side?
I wanted to, but Milako, I can talk to you and Simon other later on, so I'll give my space.
Okay. Yes, please.
Sorry, I have two questions. The first one to you.
Your name, if you introduce yourself.
Manifest Mabanda from Vector Economy in Germany.
Okay.
Mr. Simon Mervel, did you take into account in your assessment on the African Continental Free Trade Area the disruptions coming from other trading regions? When you talk about Africa treating other African countries badly, then treating products coming from outside, when you take into account that the first conflict about the Kenya-European Union Agreement, EPA, is based on the fact that the common external tariff of the EAC region is 55%. In the Kenya European Union Agreement is 25%. It's a tariff on whiskey, wines, and other alcoholic products. And now what is Kenya doing? They want to convince the other EAC members to reduce the tariff. And I think the problem we have designed would find solution through regional integration, which is exactly what Europe is trying to destroy. And a question to you, Mrs. Primi, when we talk about critical minerals or critical raw materials, I think we have to redefine the whole notion of critical. For most of the people on the countryside in Africa, water and land is critical for them, not the cobalt or nickel or something else under the ground.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, colleagues. I think I can see that we are really running out of time. I'm told that we are left only with 1 minute. So my suggestion is, given the nature of the question that came up and the comments that came up, let me encourage colleagues to speak to Simo directly or to Annalisa. I think Annalisa and Simon, the two who received questions, or maybe your question might also relate to Lucian. I don't know whether you're talking about EPAS and EU and etc.
Mine.
You're not talking about that, I know. No, that's all right. So, but I think we have.
But I have a very quick answer to the technical question, which is not so technical after all. When you say that by having the GVC for LDC initiative, you encourage suppliers around the world to buy just the raw commodity, that's not true. Because the more you place value added in LDCs, the more tariff reductions you get. If I am if we are here two competing companies for the mango from an LDC from Haiti, let's say, if I chop it and I freeze it and I process it in LDCs, I get more tariff reductions. If the gentleman next to me only imports raw mangoes, he will get less tariff reduction. So I have an incentive to place as much as I can in an LDC, because then I have a lot of tariff reduction. And don't forget the effective rate of protection, when you look at the ingredient from an LDC, it can be even 100%. So you have a strong incentive to, if you can, of course, if you have the labor force, the conditions to produce locally, that will not work against that logic.
Okay, thank you, Lucian. So, colleagues, it's exactly 10:30, no, 11:30. We started at 10:30. So, allow me to close the session now, and please join me in thanking the presenter and the panelists, all of you for the interest and everything. And I know, even if the recording stops, we will have time to discuss bilaterally. Thank you very much. Thank you.